Stephen Sidbury. The officers and inmates at Rikers Island had a name for him. They called him John Doe. It is the kind of nickname a man earns when the people paid to control him can no longer guess what he will do next. By the time he was finally sentenced for one of the things he did inside those walls, prosecutors would describe him as one of the most dangerous and volatile inmates the island had seen in years. And he had built that reputation almost entirely from inside a cell. Stephen Sidbury grew up in East New York, Brooklyn. Court records that surfaced years later showed that he began showing signs of mental illness as a small child, that he was first prescribed psychiatric medication by the age of 10 while living in foster care, and that his diagnoses eventually included bipolar disorder, post-traumatic stress, and borderline personality disorder, along with a history of suicide attempts and hospitalizations. On August 18, 2013, during a road rage argument in Brooklyn, he fired an illegal handgun into a car and killed a passenger. The man who died was young. He had a twin brother. In November 2017, a jury convicted Sidbury of first-degree manslaughter and 2 counts of criminal possession of a weapon, and he was sentenced to 40 years. Brooklyn's district attorney, Eric Gonzalez, said the shooting had robbed a family of someone who had his whole future in front of him and had left a young man without his twin. But the crime that first sent Sidbury to Rikers would end up reading like a footnote next to what he did once he was inside. By the time of that trial, he had already been cycling through the jail for years, and the record he left behind was long. According to a 2017 investigation by the Daily News, he had been tied to close to 40 violent outbursts dating back to his first arrest in 2010. He broke another inmate's jaw and headbutted a correction officer. He spat at staff and threw urine at them, and he set fire to towels inside his cell. On one occasion, in a hospital room, he reached for a correction officer's holstered gun and afterward told investigators that he had intended to kill the man. That was a warning sign written in plain language, and for years it went unheeded. Then, on January 8, 2014, he was in solitary confinement at the George R. Vierno Center, one of the jails on the island. Even alone, he found a way. He started a fire in the narrow food slot of his cell door. A correction officer noticed smoke, looked inside, and saw Sidbury feeding burning pieces of paper into the slot. When the officer tried to put the flames out, Sidbury shoved the extinguisher hose away. More than 3 years later, on March 18, 2017, just after 6:40 in the evening, he walked up to another inmate in the gym at that same facility. The other man, David Marrero, was 36. Sidbury slashed him across the right cheek and above the eye. What made the attack infamous was not only the wound. Roughly 8 officers were standing in that gym, and not one of them moved to stop it. One of them photographed Marrero's injuries, and the picture ended up online. Marrero's attorney, Pamela Roth, said the officers did nothing to intervene, and that one of them stood there taking photographs that later leaked out. You would think a scene like that, in a room full of guards, would end with someone stepping forward. Nobody did. Marrero filed a notice of claim seeking $20 million for the fire he set in his cell. Sidbury was charged with arson. He was so disruptive during the proceedings that the judge barred him from the courtroom, and in September 2018, a jury convicted him in his absence. That October, a Bronx judge added 25 years, to run consecutively to the 40 he was already serving. Bronx District Attorney Darcel Clark called him one of the most dangerous and volatile inmates Rikers had seen over several years, and said the consecutive sentence sent a message to anyone who would commit violence in a jail. That arson conviction did not last. In June 2024, New York's highest court threw it out and ordered a new trial, finding that the judge had wrongly kept jurors from hearing testimony about his mental illness. It leaves Sidbury sitting exactly where his whole story has always sat, between genuine, repeated violence and a psychiatric history that started before he could read. He was a danger to everyone around him. He was also a boy medicated at 10 and left to grow up inside a system that never seemed to have a place built for him. That question, of what a jail becomes when it is the only institution left to hold people it was never designed to manage, runs through this entire island. The next man on this list pushed it about as far as it will go, because his violence did not stop with other people. In the end, it turned on himself. Marvins Thomas. On the morning of August 30th, 2021, a correction officer at the George R. Vierno Center was doing the most ordinary part of his job. Within a few minutes, he was lying on the floor of that jail, unconscious, while the very men he was supposed to be guarding tore towels into strips and pressed them to his head to slow the bleeding. The man who put him there was a pre-trial detainee named Marvins Thomas. On the street, people knew him as Murda. Thomas was from the Bronx, a large man, roughly 6'3" and heavyset, and at that point, he was awaiting trial on a Bronx stabbing case. It is worth being careful with that detail, because the record is careful with it. He had not been convicted of anything in that case. He was being held before trial, which describes almost everyone on Rikers Island, where the overwhelming majority of detainees have not been found guilty of the thing that brought them there. Shortly after 9 that morning, according to the Bronx District Attorney's Office, Thomas began punching the officer in the head and face until the man dropped. Then, as the officer lay motionless, he kept going, kicking him in the head and stomping on his head and his back twice before taking the officer's pepper spray and walking off. It was other detainees who came to help, using those towels to try to hold back the blood loss until staff arrived. The officer needed 20 stitches in his forehead and was left with fractures to his face and a fractured skull. To put it plainly, a man being held on a violent charge nearly beat a guard to death on the floor of a city jail, and the only people who stepped in were other inmates. That October, a grand jury indicted Thomas on charges that included attempted murder and attempted aggravated murder, and a judge set his bail at $150,000. District Attorney Darcel Clark said her office would not tolerate violence against correction officers who show up to keep the jails safe. But the beating was not the end of Marvins Thomas at Rikers. It was closer to the middle. To understand what came next, it helps to know what kind of place he was being held in. Rikers has operated for years under federal court oversight because of how routine violence there had become, and a court-appointed monitor repeatedly reported that conditions were getting worse rather than better, with rates of violence, self-harm, and death in custody climbing. Thomas lived inside that reality. Records kept by the New York City Board of Correction, later quoted by student journalists at Baruch College, show that he spent 584 consecutive days in restrictive housing units at the North Infirmary Command, from the day of that beating in August 2021 straight through to the spring of 2023. Over that stretch, he was tied to 4 separate fire-related incidents inside the jail, and then came a 5th. On April 6, 2023, at around 1:15 in the afternoon, Thomas set his own cell on fire. Investigators believed it was retaliation because the jail's emergency unit had recently taken his footwear. What he used to start it tells you how much empty time a person has inside a cell like that. He stripped the wires out of a pair of headphones and used the batteries from a television remote as a heat source. The fire pushed smoke through the unit, and injured multiple detainees and officers who breathed it in. Thomas himself was burned badly enough that he needed skin graft surgery. He was treated at Harlem Hospital and sent back to Rikers in early May. He set a fire serious enough to put himself under a surgeon's care, over a pair of confiscated shoes. And no, that is not the record being exaggerated. That June, he was indicted again, this time on arson charges and 29 separate counts of assault, one for each person the smoke reached. Thomas survived the fire he set. The officers and detainees who breathed that smoke survived it too. But the pattern he left behind, a man who would rather burn down the room than lose control of it, is one that repeats across this island far more often than the city likes to admit. Stephen Espinal. There is a version of this next story that sounds almost impossible until you read the court file. A veteran correction officer, a man with a master's degree who had immigrated from Haiti and built a life around that job, ended up in an intensive care unit with a fractured spine and bleeding on his brain. The person who put him there was a teenager. And the thing that set it all in motion was a disciplinary write-up over a piece of covering on a cell window. Stephen Espinal was from Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and at the time he was 17, already jailed at Rikers on an attempted murder charge and described by prosecutors as a reputed gang member. The officer was Jean Souffrant, 39 years old, married, a man who had spent nearly a month working the same unit as the young detainee who would attack him. On February 10, 2018, at around 6:30 in the evening, inside the George Machen Detention Center, the trouble traced back to the day before, when Souffrant had written Espinal up for refusing to take down a covering over his cell window. Espinal was still angry about it. He threw a single unexpected punch that knocked Souffrant unconscious, and the officer's head struck a concrete wall as he fell. Then 5 other inmates, all of them under 21, rushed in and began stomping and kicking him, and someone threw an object at his face. Officers had to use pepper spray to break it up. In a recorded phone call before the attack, Espinal had said he was going to knock out this so-called super cop. And somehow, it gets worse, because a security camera captured the whole thing, and the footage of a group of young men beating an unconscious officer was aired across the city. Souffrant survived, but the injuries were severe. He suffered bleeding on the brain and a fractured spine in his neck, and he was hospitalized in intensive care. In February 2019, Espinal pleaded guilty to first-degree gang assault, along with the attempted murder charge in his underlying case. The following month, a judge sentenced him to 10 years on each case, to run at the same time, plus 5 years of supervision after his release. What makes the sentencing worth pausing on is what the judge chose to do with it. Espinal technically qualified for youthful offender status, a designation that can sharply reduce a young person's sentence, and prosecutors had asked for 12 years. The judge went below even that recommendation. During the hearing, he described the work of a correction officer as thankless, a word that landed heavily in a room built around a man who had nearly died doing that work. Souffrant read a statement of his own. He described the brain injury and the fractured spine he had been left with, and he talked about what the job actually meant day to day, coming to work and being verbally abused, splashed and punched, and still showing up the next morning. Then he spoke directly to Espinal. He said he had worked alongside him for nearly a month, and he asked whether he had ever once disrespected him, and whether his life had really been worth taking simply because he was doing his job. Espinal answered with an apology, saying he was sorry for everything he had done to Souffrant and his family, sorry to his own mother, and that if he could, he would take all of it back. District Attorney Darcel Clark said afterward that she had hoped for more time, to send a stronger message that gang violence would not be tolerated on Rikers Island. It is a case that sits uncomfortably between two truths that are both real. A 17-year-old is, by any measure, still a child in the eyes of the law. And that same 17-year-old, in the space of a few seconds, nearly ended the life of a man whose only offense against him had been writing his name on a form. Espinal's violence at least had a target he knew, a guard he had worked beside for weeks. The next man's violence began with a complete stranger on a train who simply happened to be standing there, and it did not stop when the doors of Rikers closed behind him. Claude White. Just before 4 a.m. on June 17, 2023, a southbound number 4 train was pulling toward the 14th Street and Union Square station in Manhattan. On board were 2 men who had gotten into a dispute. By the time the train reached the platform, one of them was dying. His name was Tavon Silver. He was 32 years old and from the Bronx, and in a cruel piece of history, he had already survived a stabbing the year before. He did not survive this one. The man who killed him would come to be known in the tabloids as the Subway Killer, and his name was Claude White. White was 33, homeless, and from the Bronx, a very large man at around 6'3" and more than 300 pounds, with a record that stretched back over a decade and included grand larceny and robbery, more than half a dozen crimes in all. On that early morning, after the dispute over drugs turned violent, White stabbed Silver once in the chest. Then he took drugs from Silver's bag, got off at the 23rd Street station, threw the knife into the subway tunnel, and dumped his sweatshirt in a trash can. Silver was pronounced dead at Bellevue Hospital. White was arrested 2 days later, on June 19th, still wearing the same clothes he had worn during the killing. It turned out he was already wanted for a bank robbery in Midtown earlier that month. In July, Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg announced an indictment charging him with 2 counts of second-degree murder and 1 count of third-degree robbery. On paper, that should have been the whole story: a violent crime, an arrest, and a case moving toward trial. It was not. While White was being held at the George R. Vierno Center on a Saturday afternoon at around 5 p.m, he turned his violence on one of the people whose job was to help evaluate him. According to Department of Correction officials, he attacked a 52-year-old licensed clinical social worker, a mental health clinician, using a 9-inch sharpened piece of metal. He stabbed the clinician 3 times in the right side of the face and once in the left forearm. The clinician was taken to a hospital and needed stitches. White was taken to Bellevue for a psychiatric evaluation. It is worth being precise about the sourcing here, the way the reporting was. This account came from correction officials rather than a filed indictment, and the Bronx District Attorney's Office said at the time that the investigation was still ongoing. And no, that detail is not something added for effect. A man accused of a subway murder was, by the account of the officials running the jail, sharpening metal into a weapon inside that jail and using it on the clinician sent to assess him. The 2 victims tell you almost everything about how this kind of case moves through the system. Tavon Silver was a man who had already cheated death once, on the streets of the Bronx, only to lose his life to a stranger on a train over a dispute that lasted a matter of minutes. The clinician was someone whose entire role was to sit across from people at their most volatile and try to understand them, and who paid for that work with wounds to the face and arm. Both of them crossed paths with the same man at 2 different points in the same system, one before it caught him and one after. White's attack on that clinician was a single incident, one afternoon. The man who comes next turned that kind of afternoon into something closer to a routine, assaulting so many officers in so short a span that one veteran captain became convinced the jail had no way to control him at all. If you're getting something out of this and you haven't hit subscribe yet, now's the time. It really does help the channel grow. Michael Megginson. A decorated captain at Rikers Island once sat down and wrote an email to his superiors that read less like a work request and more like a warning. He was asking for a security plan to deal with a single detainee, a mentally ill man who, by the captain's own count, had assaulted 32 correction officers in the span of 6 months. For raising the alarm the way he did, the captain was later suspended. The detainee at the center of it was named Michael Megginson, and his story is less about a monster than about a system that never found anywhere to put him. Megginson grew up in the Bronx, and by the time reporters began paying close attention to him, he had been moving in and out of psychiatric hospitals since the age of 6. In 2015, the New York Times built a major investigation around him, examining how the city's jails had quietly become its largest mental health institutions, holding thousands of people who, by any medical standard, belonged somewhere designed to treat them. He was 25 when that piece ran. Years later, still trapped in the same loop, he would turn up in coverage listed as 33, older but no further out of the cycle. The detail the Times pressed hardest is one that reframes everything that followed, and it is how minor the offense was that first pulled him into the machine. He was not arrested for an act of violence. He was arrested for stealing a cell phone. His first stay at Rikers had actually come earlier, at 19, after a fight in which he attacked his mother with a knife. She survived. He served 3 months, and from there the arrests kept arriving, most of them for assaults, including one at a shelter that was supposed to house people living with mental illness. What happened once he was inside is where the figures stopped sounding real. Over a single 18-month stretch, according to the Times, Megginson was involved in roughly 70 physical confrontations with correction officers. He fought inmates and staff, smashed windows and furniture, and threw urine at officers. And on one occasion, he stabbed an officer in the back of the head with a shard of glass. That is not a typo, by the way. 70 confrontations in a year and a half, from one person. The captain who wrote that desperate email, Awais Gowrie, was not a soft touch. He was a decorated officer who had simply concluded that the situation was unmanageable without a real plan. And even his alarming figure, 32 officers assaulted in 6 months, captured only part of the picture. Reporting on the case noted that a little over half of Megginson's assaults involved splashing or throwing liquid at officers, a category of attack that staff on the island know all too intimately. The rest were far worse. He had open cases for slashing an officer with a pen, for trying to attack an officer with a makeshift blade, for beating an officer with metal restraints, and for slashing 3 officers at once with a length of broken pipe. You would think that somewhere in all of that, someone with authority would have decided a man like this needed a hospital far more than a cell. For years, nobody did. Instead, Gowrie's reward for putting the danger in writing was a suspension, and that, more than any single assault, is the part of Megginson's story that lingers. The people closest to the problem understood exactly how dangerous and how hopeless it had become, and the institution's instinct was to quiet the messenger rather than solve the crisis. And this is where his story refuses to stay simple, because he was not only a man who hurt officers. By his own account, and in his lawyer's filings, he was also a man who was hurt inside those walls. He brought federal civil rights lawsuits accusing officers of beating him, pointing to an incident in December 2021 that involved pepper spray and a baton, and another in October 2022 that he said put him in the hospital. A federal judge, Nina Morrison, allowed the 2022 case to move forward. The Times had said it plainly, that a person like Megginson belonged in a psychiatric hospital rather than a jail, and that Rikers had made his condition worse instead of better. It is a conclusion that sits uneasily against a word like terrorized, because the man doing so much of the damage was, at the same time, being ground down by the same broken system he was tearing at. By the time the city was paying attention, Megginson had become a kind of symbol, cited by advocates and reporters as proof that Rikers was being asked to do a job no jail was ever built for. He was far from the only mentally ill person cycling through those units, but the sheer volume of his confrontations made him impossible to overlook. Officers who had spent years on the island said they had rarely seen anything like the frequency of his outbursts, and administrators struggled to find any housing arrangement that kept both Megginson and the staff around him safe. For the people on the receiving end, none of that context softened the blow. A pen driven toward an eye, a length of pipe dragged across skin, a substance thrown into a face that could not be identified in the moment. These were the injuries and the fear that his name came to mean on the units where he was held. Megginson never killed anyone. For all the blood spilled in his name inside Rikers, the mother he attacked survived, and every officer he assaulted lived to file the report. The man who comes next did not share that distinction. He walked into the jail with a killing already behind him, and the woman he had shot was carrying his child. Dennis Applewhite. On Halloween afternoon in 2022, a correction officer working one of the protective custody units at the Anna M. Cross Center was attacked from behind. By the time it was over, he had been stabbed roughly 15 times in the back of the head. He survived, which is close to a miracle. The man who attacked him was already sitting in that jail for killing the mother of his unborn child, and he went by two names, Dennis Applewhite and Dennis Fredericks. Applewhite was 29, from the Bronx, and a known member of a gang called Air It Out. He was no stranger to the system. His record ran back to 2008, and in 2014 he had drawn a 3-year prison sentence on a conspiracy conviction tied to a gun charge, which had left him on parole that was supposed to run all the way until 2023. He would not finish that parole as a free man, and the reason was a crime that unsettled even a city long used to violence. On November 11, 2021, Applewhite shot his girlfriend, Brittany Duffy, in the neck at the Vladek houses on the Lower East Side. Duffy was 27, and she was pregnant. She did not die at the scene. She held on for days before she was gone, and in that stretch, the search for the man who shot her turned into a citywide manhunt. What Applewhite did after pulling the trigger reads like a man determined to hurt as many people as possible on his way out. He fled, then carjacked a 72-year-old motorist in the parking lot of a convenience store, crashed the stolen vehicle, and fought with officers before he was finally taken into custody across the state line in Bergen County, New Jersey. He was brought back to New York and held on Rikers Island without bail on a murder charge, starting in February 2022. For 8 months, he sat in that jail awaiting trial, and then came the attack. On Monday, October 31st, 2022, at around 4:45 in the afternoon, Applewhite set upon the officer assigned to the protective custody unit and stabbed him about 15 times in the back of the head. The officer, who was 28 years old, was rushed to Elmhurst Hospital in serious but stable condition. He lived. When you sit with the number of wounds and where they landed, that survival is difficult to explain by anything other than luck. And somehow, it gets worse, because this was not a brawl that spiraled. By every official account, it was completely unprovoked. There is a grim irony in where it happened. A protective custody unit exists to shield the most vulnerable people in a jail, the ones who would be in danger in general population. It is meant to be the safest place on the island. Applewhite turned it into a crime scene. The city's correction commissioner at the time, Louis Molina, described it as an unprovoked, heinous, and callous attack, and said his department would not tolerate assaults on the members of service who came to work each day to keep the jails safe. The stabbing also landed in the middle of a fierce political fight over how Rikers should be run. The president of the Correction Officers Union, Benny Boscio, pointed to the attack as evidence against a proposed bill that would have sharply curtailed the use of solitary confinement, arguing that officers needed every tool available to protect themselves from men exactly like this one. Critics of solitary countered that isolation was part of what made Rikers so violent and so deadly in the first place. Applewhite's case gave both sides something to hold up. The details of the manhunt stayed with people. Here was a man on long-running parole, already known to law enforcement, who in the span of a single day allegedly went from shooting his pregnant girlfriend to carjacking an elderly stranger to brawling with police 2 states away. Each step made him more dangerous, and each step deepened the sense that the system had every reason to be watching him, and somehow was not. By the time he reached Rikers, he had already shown exactly what he was capable of. The stabbing of that officer 8 months later was less a surprise than a confirmation. But underneath the politics and the jailhouse stabbing sits the fact that should never slip out of focus, and that is who Brittany Duffy was. She was a young woman carrying a child, killed by the man who was supposed to love her, shot in the neck and left to fight for her life for days before it ended. The correction officer Applewhite attacked survived his 15 wounds. Duffy did not survive her 1. That is the true measure of the man at the center of this story. For the correction officers working the Anna M. Cross Center, the attack became one more entry in a long ledger of violence that year, a period when Rikers was posting some of the worst conditions in its modern history, with a federal monitor warning that the jail was slipping further out of control. Applewhite was not the whole of that crisis, but a man stabbing a guard some 15 times in a unit built for safety, 8 months into a murder case, was about as sharp an illustration of it as anyone could have drawn. Applewhite's violence, for all its brutality, still fit a shape investigators recognized: a man with a record, a gun, and a jealous rage that spilled over. The person who comes next broke that shape completely. What he did to his own mother was so far beyond the ordinary vocabulary of crime that the newspapers reached for a nickname, and the one they settled on has followed him ever since. Bahsid McLean. In December 2016, one day before Bahsid McLean was scheduled to be shipped from Rikers Island to a state prison, he attacked a correction officer with a small blade, slashing him across the face, breaking his nose, and briefly knocking him unconscious. It would have been a serious crime committed by anyone. But McLean was not just anyone. He was a convicted murderer whose case had already earned him a name the tabloids could not resist, and they called him the New York Butcher. To understand where that name came from, you have to go back to February 2013, and it is not an easy story to sit with. McLean was 23, living in the Bronx, and he carried a long history of mental illness. His defense would later describe diagnoses that included schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, and would say he had been hearing voices since around the age of 10. He was already on probation when it happened, the result of an earlier incident in which he had attacked 2 police officers with a knife. According to his family, he harbored a deep resentment toward his mother for having placed him in foster care as a child, and he was jealous of the attention she gave his younger brother, who had Down syndrome. That mother was the victim. Her name was Tanya Bird. She was 45 years old, and she worked as a home health aide, a woman whose living was made caring for other people. On February 25, 2013, inside their apartment in the Morrisania section of the Bronx, McLean stabbed her to death following an argument in which she told him he was not a good father. What he did afterward is the reason the case became infamous, and I am going to describe it the way the court did, rather than dwell on the specifics. He dismembered her body using a saw he had bought from a hardware store, photographed himself holding part of her remains, and then scattered what was left across several blocks of the Bronx, sealed inside garbage bags and suitcases, telling a friend along the way that he was only taking out the trash. When prosecutors later played a recorded statement at trial, McLean was heard offering a chillingly casual justification, saying that anyone able to kill a person should be able to cut them up as well, and that lacking the stomach for it would only make a person a coward. A Bronx jury did not need much time with that. In November 2016, after deliberating only a matter of hours, they convicted McLean of second-degree murder and the rare charge of unlawful dissection of a human being. The following month, Justice Jeanette Rodriguez-Morick sentenced him to the maximum the law allowed, 25 years to life for the murder, with additional time for the dissection ordered to run consecutively. District Attorney Darcel Clark said that he had fatally stabbed his own mother and then posed with her mutilated remains, and that the verdict ensured he would serve every year the statutes permitted. The sentencing was almost as hard to witness as the crime. McLean's own grandfather, James McLean, 75 years old, stood in the courtroom and spoke directly to him, asking who had given him the authority to decide who lives and who dies, reminding him that he had been the one to teach him how to walk, and telling him he had broken his heart in a way that would never mend. His sister, Portia Lovett, said it was one of the hardest days she would ever have to face, sitting through the sentencing of her own brother, and she asked him a question that had no answer: why he had taken their mother from them. The photograph was what seared the case into public memory. In an era when almost everyone carried a phone, McLean had turned his most monstrous act into an image, and that single fact, more than any of the legal charges, was what earned him his nickname and made him one of the most reviled defendants to move through the Bronx courts in years. By the time he reached Rikers for that final stretch, he was not an anonymous detainee. He was a man whose face and whose crime were known to nearly everyone working the island. Which brings the story back to that jailhouse slashing. Roughly a week before he was due to be transferred out for good, McLean had been moved into the West Facility, a unit that held some of the most violent people on the island. On December 14, 2016, at around 7:15 in the evening, he attacked Correction Officer Matthew Hines, slashing him above the eye and across the forehead with a scalpel-like weapon, breaking his nose and knocking him briefly unconscious. Hines needed staples and stitches to close the wounds. McLean was later indicted on an attempted assault charge, and it emerged that he already had a separate pending case for slashing a fellow inmate inside the jail. The correction commissioner at the time, Joseph Ponte, said he was outraged by the unprovoked attack. The head of the officers' union, Elias Husamuddin, made a bitter observation that stuck with many who heard it. pointing out that there would be no marches through the streets of New York when a dedicated correction officer was slashed above the eye by a convicted killer. McLean fit the premise of this list about as completely as any person could. A killer whose capacity for violence continued right up to the day he was carried off the island. The final name is a different case altogether. He was a murderer, and he passed through Rikers, but the mark he left on New York was not carved with a blade or lit with a match. It was left on a recording in a single phone call that would echo all the way to the state's highest court. Cadman Williams. Every man on this list so far left his mark on Rikers Island in the same language, with fists, with blades, with fire. The last name belongs here for a different reason, and it is worth being honest about that from the start. Cadman Williams did not terrorize the guards. There is no record of him assaulting officers, setting fires, or running a housing unit. What earns him a place in this story is the killing that sent him to the island in the first place, and a phone call he made from inside those walls that would go on to change how courts across New York handle the science of DNA. The crime itself happened in May 2008 in the Bronx. Williams was part of a group of teenagers when a man and his brother got into a dispute with them, and at one point the man swung a baseball bat at one of the teens. Williams pulled out a gun and fired 4 times. 2 of the bullets struck the man, and both wounds proved fatal. He managed to stagger into the lobby of a nearby apartment building before he collapsed and died. The court record the case rests on does not name the victim, and his identity did not surface in the news coverage either, so I am not going to invent one for him. What is certain is that a man lost his life over a street confrontation that was already winding down. After the shooting, Williams hid the gun in an ex-girlfriend's apartment, telling her plainly that he had just shot someone, and then he fled, moving through several neighboring states before he was finally arrested months later back in Brooklyn. He was charged with murder, and on its face it looked like a grim but fairly ordinary Bronx homicide case. It became anything but ordinary. To help convict Williams, prosecutors leaned in part on 2 cutting-edge forensic techniques developed by the city's Office of the Chief Medical Examiner. The first was a method for analyzing extremely small or degraded amounts of genetic material, known as low-copy number DNA testing. The second was a piece of proprietary software the office had built to calculate the statistical likelihood that a particular person's DNA was present in a mixed sample. At the time, both were being used to help send people to prison, and both had gone largely unchallenged in New York courtrooms. Williams was convicted and sentenced to 25 years to life. His appeal, though, traveled all the way to the New York Court of Appeals, the highest court in the state, and in 2020 it produced a decision, People versus Williams, that would reshape the ground beneath thousands of cases. Writing for the court, Judge Eugene Fahey held that the trial court had abused its discretion as a matter of law by allowing that DNA evidence and that software to be presented to a jury without first holding a hearing to determine whether the underlying science was generally accepted as reliable. In plain terms, the court told judges across New York that they could no longer simply wave this kind of evidence through. It had to be scrutinized first. The decision did not come out of nowhere. For years, defense attorneys and outside scientists had raised pointed questions about both techniques, arguing that the medical examiner's methods had never been properly validated by the wider scientific community, and that the software's inner workings were hidden from the very people it was being used to convict. The Williams ruling gave those arguments the force of law, and in the years that followed, prosecutors and crime labs had to reckon with the possibility that evidence they had treated as ironclad might not survive a proper hearing. There is a bitter twist buried in that victory. at least for Williams himself. Even as it announced the new rule, the court concluded that in his particular case, the error had not changed the outcome, because the rest of the evidence against him was overwhelming. There was video of the shooting. There was an eyewitness who identified him, and there was the ex-girlfriend who testified about the gun and about his confession to her. So his conviction stood. Williams lost his own appeal, and in losing it, he helped set a precedent that would protect countless defendants who came after him. As for the Rikers connection, the thread that ties his name to this island at all, it is quiet next to everything else on this list. It was a phone call. While he was held there before trial, Williams made a recorded call from the jail that prosecutors would later use as part of their case. Because he was ultimately handed a long state sentence, he was moved into the state prison system rather than kept at Rikers for years, which is almost certainly why there is no trail of jailhouse violence behind his name. He was a killer who passed through the island, not one who ruled it. That makes Williams an unusual figure to end on, and it is exactly why he is worth including. Not every person who moved through Rikers left a scar on a guard or a burn mark on a wall. Some of them were simply killers who happened to be processed through the most notorious jail in the country on their way to somewhere else, and whose real legacy was written in a courtroom rather than a cell block. Today, Cadman Williams remains in state custody, his conviction intact, his name preserved in a court ruling that has outlasted the case that created it. Those are 8 of the men who passed through the most feared jail in New York, and the marks they left behind. Thanks for watching. Click here to see our next video.